Romantic. The French town of Le Quesnoy. Characterized by its fortress-like structure, the population was occupied by German forces from the very start of the Great War in 1914. At the same time, Leslie Averill and Paul Clark attended Christ College here in Ōtautahi. 17 years old and in their final year of high school, Clark played rugby and had for 3 years. Meanwhile, Averill was head boy. Despite the war reaching even the bottom of the world here in Aotearoa, these young men could not imagine what the next 4 years would have in store for them. Both then went on to Auckland University College to study medicine. Paul had even been awarded the Maria Blackett Scholarship at St. John's Theological College in 1915. He was studying to become a doctor. We know from the John Kenda Theological Library that there is correspondence from Paul to the St. John's College Trust Board, asking them to hold his scholarship until he returned from the war. Clark could not afford to continue his studies in medicine, even with the scholarship. He writes that after the war he should have obtained both experience and funds to further his studies. Averill joined him despite his parents' objections, and after training both Clark and Averill were commissioned. On the 8th of February 1918, they left New Zealand with the 34th Reinforcements. Clark was then transferred to the New Zealand Rifle Brigade, alongside his friend. We're steaming ahead for England and France, all willing to do our bit. We're willing to live or die, just as chance in her uncertain way thinks fit. But in the back of the mind of each one of us is the land we are longing to see, where bushfire and beach are part of us, way back in uncountry.
We tend to think of the First World War as half a decade of unmitigated horror that was utterly pointless and wasteful. Now, all war is waste. There's no question about that. Sometimes, however, they have to be fought. You must be very careful before you get involved in a war.
Gallipoli was a learning curve for us, but the true cost of the war we paid on the Western Front. And the amazing thing is that if it hadn't been for Allen and his reinforcement system, we would not have bounced back from the Somme, or from Messines, or from Passchendaele. And we certainly wouldn't have been 18,000 strong at Le Quesnoy.
The Western Front in 1918 speaks to the brutality and the carnage of the First World War. Even now, we are still struggling to understand the tragedy and the loss of life. Paul Clark was killed in action fighting near Bapaume, France on the 26th of August 1918. He was 21 years old. The Battle of Bapaume was part of the 100 Days Offensive, forcing German forces back to the Hindenburg Line. The New Zealand Division suffered high numbers of casualties during this one campaign, with over 2,100 killed. New Zealand itself had a population of just 1,150,000 at the time.
There wasn't such a variation in age because the men of 1914 had a lot of very young men and a lot of old men. And when I say old men, you got men in their late 30s. That is old for an infantryman. For a combat infantryman, that is getting old. That had pretty much ceased by 1918. It was much more. They were much more uniform in their ages.
During this battle, Leslie Averill was awarded the Military Cross for exceptional gallantry and fine leadership. 3 months remain in the war. Averill carries on with the Rifle Brigade. He is 21.
The cork in the bottle that's facing Russell is the Quesnoy. But he doesn't want to go through it. He wants to go around it. Villages are not objectives, they're obstacles, and they should be bypassed because all they will do is cost the lives of his men.
The road to victory was paved with mud, smoke, and mist, and this is what the troops awoke to at 0 hour, 5:30 a.m. The New Zealand division reaches Le Quesnoy. Medieval walls rise out of the fog. They've been here in German hands since 1914.
It's the last battle of the war. They don't know it at that stage, but that's how it turns out. On a 48-kilometre frontage, 3 British armies and 15th Corps of the New Zealand Division is on the boundary of 2 Corps with 67 Division to the north and 37 Division to the south. Meanwhile, the Germans who were defending the railway line find that instead of being able to withdraw, they've been cut off by the fact that the town is encircled, and so they retreat inside the town. And at the start of the battle, there was about 200 Germans manning the walls, very few really, and about 600 German wounded in the hospital in the town. Because the people on the railway line couldn't get away, they moved into the town, and now there's a garrison of about 1,200 Germans.
I think if I'd been there, if I'd been a German soldier, I would have said, time's up. The innocence of the New Zealand army was lost in Gallipoli. So by the time they got to France, there were no illusions. The type of warfare was different. It was warfare, and they knew that they were going to encounter casualties. Their discipline was very fierce. The New Zealanders were very strong in discipline, and this was a notable contrast to the Australians.
That's how the British Army regarded the New Zealand Division at this point. It was one of the most best trained because it retained its trained soldiers of all the divisions in the British Army. And by that stage, the Canadians were running out of men and the Australians were running out of men. In fact, the Australians had been withdrawn from combat. So by now, it's the Canadians and the New Zealand Division that are still fighting as part of the British Army.
4 years of occupation, thousands of French civilians still inside. The forces could not bombard Le Quesnoy. There were French civilians sheltering inside of the walls. To use such force was to destroy the very people that they had come to liberate and the rich history of the town.
But the most important thing to Russell were the lives of his soldiers, because they were trained and they were difficult to replace. He told his commanders before every attack, villages are only obstacles. They're not ends in themselves, and so if you can bypass them.
They needed to find another way. Messages were written in German and dropped over the town. It read, "To the commander of the garrison of Le Quesnoy. The position of Le Quesnoy is now completely surrounded. Our troops are far east of the town. You are therefore requested to surrender with your garrison." Many of the German soldiers were exhausted. They were demoralized. Many of them knew or hoped that the war was almost over.
And suddenly, they are on the defensive and they are going backwards and they are not being reinforced. Back in Germany, there was a severe loss of morale, a feeling that this war is now over. They felt, the soldiers, many of them,
The garrison of that village has no choice but to surrender. And that's how he was going to approach Le Quesnoy.
But their officers refused to surrender, not without a fight. Scouts are sent to find a way in. Leslie Averill is among them. They continue to investigate the defences. The walls are 18 metres high, solid brick and stone. There is no way in through the gates, nowhere in through the walls, no way in except for over. They need ladders. The Māori battalion and the engineers go out and gather them. But the ladders are too short. The inner fortifications, the final wall, cannot be reached from the moats. There is a narrow stone bridge on the other side. They must bounce on that tiny bridge in the mist and the smoke and raise the ladder against the final wall. It is now approximately 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Major Harold Barrowclough, 29 years old, selects a small group of men, Second Lieutenant H.W. Kerr, 3 riflemen and Leslie Averill, with 30 centimetres to spare, resting against a grassy bank that hides the top of the ladder from the view inside of the town. Averill starts to climb. With him, he carries a revolver.
A revolver is a very short range and largely ineffectual weapon. They knew full well the effective weapon, but very likely because he had to climb up the ladder.
Reaching the top, he steps over the coping onto the grassy bank. He crouches and looks over at 2 German soldiers at a guard post. He fires, forcing them to take cover. The rest of the battalion swarms up the ladder behind them. Barrowclough himself comes. Even now, the German forces failed to relent, attempting to order a counter-attack.
Averill climbed up first, Lieutenant Kerr came next, and Averill fired a few shots at the heads of some Germans who were looking at them, and they raced into the city or into the town shouting, "The Tommies have arrived." And once that, there was a mass surrender. There was no fighting really in the town itself. The battalion commanders have had bets with each other as to who would get in first. And Jardine later complains and said, "We would have been first in, except all the townsfolk came out with bottles of wine and apple brandy and held us up." A brave act, but by that stage, they've got no means of escape. And so that was inevitable at some point.
But the Kiwis swarmed the town at such a speed that they at last surrendered. Over 700 prisoners taken inside Le Quesnoy alone. As the New Zealand soldiers entered the town, they discovered what 4 years of German occupation looks like. The prisoners were in a condition that shocked the soldiers who found them. 4 days before the armistice, the whole street was a mess of indescribably excited townspeople. Averill writes later in his report of the event that the delight of the people of Le Quesnoy on being free again knew no bounds. that their liberators had come from the other side of the world, helped them in their hour of need, impressed them very greatly, and this battle was a sacrifice that would never be forgotten.
It was the whole division was moving with such speed and professionalism, and they were using what we called mixed arm tactics. The same principles were taught to me.
The bond formed on the 4th of November 1918 was never broken. In 1923, Leslie Averill returned to Quesnoy for the unveiling of the New Zealand War Memorial. In 1968, the town appointed him an honorary citizen, and in 1977, a new school and street in Quesnoy was named after him. Cambridge, New Zealand, and Quesnoy, France, are twin towns. There is a museum in the town with names in English, Te Reo Māori, and French. Te Arewhata is the Te Reo Māori word for ladder, invoking the impression of a higher pathway. Leslie Averill came back after he finished his studies in medicine at the University of Edinburgh, gaining a scholarship in October of 1919. He became a doctor and then a pillar of the Christchurch medical community, living until 1981. On the 27th of April 1919, Leslie Averill's father, Alfred Averill, dedicated to the memory of Paul G. Clarke his name on an oak front cover at St. Aidan's Church in Auckland.
And it's a continual cycle. Reinforcements coming in, wounded, returned to New Zealand, 28,000, because we sent over 100,000 men to war, and by the end of the war we've had 60,000 casualties, 6 in every 10.
The capture of Quesnoy and the subsequent liberation of the citizens invokes a kind of mythological sense. Indeed, at the unveiling of the Quesnoy Memorial, it was said that the New Zealanders, in scaling the high ramparts of the fortress, which were considered unscalable, reached the final turning point of the war and achieved the pinnacle of their wonderful record. It was the most daring act for a mere handful of New Zealanders to place a flimsy ladder against the Great Wall and mount in single file.
Completely out of the usual type of combat of the First World War, going over walls. That's not something that they'd been doing. So yes, it was. It's not fairy tale, then it certainly was something really unusual and dramatic.
And from 1923 onwards, at a time when no New Zealanders could get there, they remembered. We owe it to them to remember.